we're not just this strange other category, is that actually a lot of the kind of issues and discriminations that trans people are experiencing are things that many other groups are experiencing, and that actually if you helped trans people, you would help a lot of other marginalised people in society as well.
Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival, live at the Edinburgh College of Art. My name's Harry Josephine Giles, or Josie for short, and I'm here today with Dr. Pragya Agarwal and Shon Faye, who I'm really delighted to be hosting in an event on their books, respectively, Motherhood, or Otherhood, and the Transgender Issue. It's fantastic to have such a good live audience here, and fantastic also to have so many people joining us online from all sorts of different places. I'm going to introduce our two guests, and then we're going to have about 40 minutes or so of discussion about these two fantastic books before a chance for yourselves to ask questions. And we'll be taking questions from both the live audience here and from the online audience as well. So about our authors and our books, seated on stage with me here is Dr. Pragya Agarwal, who is a behavioural and data scientist. After gaining her PhD from the University of Nottingham, she was a senior academic in US and UK universities for over 12 years. As well as numerous research papers, she is the author of Wish We Knew What to Say, Talking with Children About Race, and also Sway, Unravelling Unconscious Bias, which was picked as the best science book of 2020, a Guardian Book of the Week, and was also shortlisted for the Transmission Prize. And then behind me, on the big screen, and also in front of me, by the way, which is why I'm going to talk to her here, is Shon Faye. Shon Faye was born in Bristol and is now based in London. After training as a lawyer, she left the law to pursue writing and campaigning, working in the charity sector with Amnesty International and Stonewall. She was editor-at-large at Dazed, and her writing has been published by The Guardian, The Independent, and Vice, among others. Faye recently launched an acclaimed podcast series, Call Me Mother, interviewing trailblazing LGBTQ+ elders. The last thing that remains for me to say before we really dig into these books is just to say that for folk who join us online or join us later, you get to join Pay What You Can, which I think is fantastic and a great measure to bring as many audiences into these events as possible. But I'm gonna like pressure you a tiny bit to genuinely pay what you can, if you can. And what I would say about that is, if you're earning less than a living wage, like, don't pay. Like, genuinely, like, everyone deserves art, but if you're living comfortably, you should probably pay the same ticket price as everybody else. And if you're joining us from your second home, then I really want you to cough up, okay? Like, really, like, act some redistribution here, okay? Some of us have to get paid, that's all I'm saying. Right, oh dear, that was a slight, oh dear. Let's talk about some books. I'm really excited to bring these two books into conversation, because between the two of them, we've got two strong, researched and passionate arguments for intersectional and liberatory feminisms. And I think being able to bring those two books into conversation is quite a rare chance. And I'd really like to dig into these aspects of both of those and find ways that these books speak to each other about the issues that matter to women, to trans people and gender minorities, to mothers, to parents, and what it is that's holding back liberation and how we can move towards that. So that's my kind of excitement about it. But let's hand over to the authors. I'd like to start just by asking you both, and we'll start with yourself, Pragya. What drew you to write this book, Motherhood, in this moment? And what kind of intervention were you hoping to make with it?
So thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be here, especially with you two. When I started writing the book, I was really conscious of how polarized this discourse was becoming about the notion of these labels of womanhood and women and who decides who is a woman and not. And increasingly, we're seeing this discourse becoming more and more polarized. And I was thinking about the notion of these labels of mothers and women and how the weight or the baggage they carry, and how some people dominate the mainstream narrative and some people are pushed to the fringes and they don't have a say or a platform. And so I think I really wanted to explore, investigate this notion about what it means to be a woman. Who decides who's a woman or not? How can we campaign for equality and equity and talk about feminism when we are not including everybody in it, when we are not taking an intersectional approach? And so that's where the book came from. And of course, I used my lens as kind of an investigation on these issues.
Thank you. That's a really interesting way, I think, of framing the book. And I think it does do such a good job of digging into sort of what this term mother makes possible, and also what it kind of constrains. And I think we're gonna dig into that quite a lot more. But I'd like to throw the same question to yourself, Shon, of why this book right now, and what made you want to write it. I was interested, actually, right at the end, there's a bit about your agent persuading you to write this book. So what is it that persuaded you in the end to write this one?
I mean, that's it. I still wasn't sure about it, even as it went off to print. I mean, whether or not, I think where I mentioned that in my acknowledgements, what you're alluding to, is I was initially reluctant, because I guess there's a fear about being framed when you're a writer from a minority, is that I wanted to just be judged as a writer, and I was concerned about writing a book about transness and trans politics as a writer who is trans would forever kind of frame me or maybe pigeonhole me into that. And I think that's a reasonable fear a lot of people have. But what kind of convinced me, I think, was my own experience having tried to be like, a mainstream writer, about trans lives in the kind of late 2010s, where increasingly I was being forced by the kind of a journalistic landscape in the mainstream media into always being into a reactive position. It was very hard to kind of convince editors or commissioners to take articles or take pieces or take suggestions about trans lives from a kind of non-reactive standpoint, about some of the kind of issues that really centered trans people in their actual lives, their material conditions. And often what was happening was a kind of cisgender-led discussion about, I don't know, basically nonsense, but basically about issues that were about cisgender anxieties about trans people. And so I wanted to center trans people in the conversation and to kind of, have a mainstream text, because I saw that happening obviously in online ephemeral spaces amongst friends who are academics, but I felt in the kind of mainstream, there wasn't a synthesizing of some of the kind of great work I was seeing other trans thinkers produce. And I wanted to kind of center trans thought and trans lives in a discussion in the mainstream. So that's kind of what led me to write it. And then, to link from outwards, to kind of show how we're not just this strange other category, is actually a lot of the kind of issues and discriminations that trans people are experiencing are things that many other groups are experiencing, and that actually if you helped trans people, you would help a lot of other marginalized people in society as well.
Thank you. And I think we can already say, like, your book is achieving many of those goals already. It's been wonderful to see some of the reception that it's had. And also, we should say, a long excerpt from it on the lives of transgender children and young people is published in The Guardian today, which readers can have a look at. Speaking also of the things that kind of, some of the constraints that were around the book and the decisions that you made in writing it, there's some interesting points in the book where you essentially sort of refuse memoir as a genre, and you refuse to tell particular details of your personal life. And there's a couple of bits where you draw on your personal life, but for the most part, you very firmly place that outside of the book. And would you like to say a bit about why that is? What made you want to kind of enact that refusal, and what does that make possible?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Well, I think it was just because I felt memoir is one of the few literary forms that trans people, particularly trans women, trans feminine people, have been allowed historically. And obviously I don't, I have a lot of respect for it as a form, actually. And I think there's still, Paris Lee's memoir this year was very good. And obviously I think there was one the fact that I was aware that perhaps my life wasn't particularly, it was the life of a middle-class white trans woman, and I'm not really sure that I felt comfortable politically taking up space to talk about myself, considering that some of the systemic issues I wanted to discuss weren't ones I had experience of, frankly. And so I was willing to, I'd rather report. And although, yes, I am a trans author and I obviously have a vested interest, and that's what the narrative voice suggests, I would rather have kind of sought out and challenged myself to seek out the people who have experienced some of the things that I'm talking about, particularly the most vulnerable trans people. So it was kind of an authorial challenge to myself to kind of not rely on my own experience. But also, it allows a more expansive, I think often trans people are trapped into kind of a subjectivity where we have to kind of draw on both our own trauma, our own experience as a kind of evidence for arguments we make. And actually, I don't see other political writing where that's expected. And I think there has been great inroads in other books. So things like Revolting Prostitutes and Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race were two books that I hugely drew on about sex work. And obviously, Renée Lodge's book is obviously a phenomenon, so I'm sure most people have heard of it. And I liked in both those cases, really, the authors did draw occasionally on their own experience, but actually kind of refused memoir too. And I thought that was, writing from a marginal position was a kind of interesting power grab, I guess, to be able to talk about what you wanted to talk about.
That's really interesting, and I think a powerful explanation of the possibilities there. But passing to yourself, Pragya, you've kind of made the inverse decision, although from some of the same motivations, I think, and you've woven a very interesting, stylish memoir through a medical history and a cultural analysis of motherhood. And you've balanced those two approaches together and used them to ask questions of each other, I think. Can you say a bit about what drew you to that approach? Because this, I think, is your first your book that has involved memoir in that way.
Yes, and I completely I agree with what Shon is saying, and I think we talked briefly before the panel about how much we are expected to draw from our pain and trauma and our position as a minority in writing, and how we are expected to kind of mine it in a way. So my two other books, especially Sway, wasn't related to personal issues. I was taking a more broader outlook. But in this book, because I felt motherhood is such a personal, intimate act, and I wanted to open up this space, a conversation for a lot of other minority communities, women of color, but also trans women and trans men and non-binary individuals. But I didn't want to speak on anybody's behalf because I don't belong to these communities. I looked for research studies, and actually, unfortunately, there's a lack of research studies which also kind of document people's experiences. So I dug around. I wanted to use it as a platform to open up this conversation, to say, yes, we need to look at these diverse intersectional experiences of parenting, motherhood, or womanhood, but I can only talk from my own experience. And that's why I need to use my own experience as a lens to widen this conversation, to say, this is what I went through, these are the experiences, this was what my context was. I need to make sure what my context is clear to the reader so that they cannot assume that I'm speaking on somebody else's behalf or actually campaigning for other communities. So I really wanted to use my own experience as a lens to broaden out these conversations, but also use them as a stepping stone to these research studies and all the historical research, archival research, scientific research that I found about it. But I also wanted to kind of shatter this genre of memoir, this form that we take. And that's why in the introduction I say, is it really a memoir or is it a fiction? I don't want to put a box around it. I want the reader to take what they want from it. They should be free to take what they want from it, and I should be free to write in whatever form I want to write. I think we limit people, writers, especially writers of minority communities. So it was a small act of rebellion in a way.
Wonderful. I love that act of rebellion. And you certainly have shattered that genre, and also I think shattered, as the title does, ideas about motherhood. It really takes motherhood apart. One of the ways that you do that is in the framing at the beginning, you dig into some questions of autonomy. And I'm going to do the awkward thing of quoting you back to yourself, because I was really interested in this. You say very near the beginning, I've often wondered if, even in this era of unprecedented freedom and choice, women are really free to understand their own reproductive options and have the autonomy to shape these decisions. But what is autonomy? The primary criticism of women's autonomy when it comes to their own reproductive health is that we're never really free of the interference of the state in society. And then later in the book, you also critique autonomy as often being examined from a Western and a Eurocentric perspective. And yet at the same time, you do finish the book with this very strident call for bodily autonomy, for women's autonomy, for the autonomy of mothers and parents. So I'm wondering, how do you work through these contradictions? How do we do with autonomy when the notion itself is a bit of a problem?
It is, isn't it? Because we are shaped by our context and we are shaped by our position in society. But I think this is something that I feel that we need to understand more and reflect on, that or we can't homogenize people's experiences. Even when we talk about autonomy, it often, as I say, comes from a Western perspective or from a white woman, middle class, middle to upper class kind of a perspective, sometimes cisgender perspective, and often even talk about reproductive decision-making is limited by our position in terms of our sexuality, our gender, our sex, our class, our race. All these things determine these things, our economic situation as well. For instance, when we talk about abortion debate that's happening in the US, yes, where we are, whether we have the financial means to carry out or undertake this or not, whether we believe this is the right choice or not, whether our religion allows it or not, whether all those kind of things come into play. So even when we're making these decisions, we sometimes internalize these messages as well. So I might feel like this is the right decision for me, but I might have internalized what society is telling me. Mothers, for instance, are discriminated in careers, in choices. We know about the motherhood penalty. And so often this becomes kind of a binary decision between motherhood and career that women have to make. And I wanted to kind of just look at the ambivalence around it, look at these blurry boundaries around it, and say that actually these are not binary debates or discourses that we should be focusing on. We often take such a binary approach to things. But at the same time, I want my children, I want everybody to have bodily autonomy, but without the pressures of the state. But we have to look at the capitalist society. We have to look at the society and the messages that it's giving us. We have to look at whether all women have the same choices and are able to make the same decisions without pressures of state and society, which we don't at the moment. So I think we need to look at it beyond this binary.
I'm 100% behind you on all of this. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it all. And then passing to yourself, Shon, I was fascinated. There's so many points of connections between the book, but you also place this word, autonomy, right at the front of your book. In this case, you're quoting the writer and performer Travis Alabanza, who says, "When I say trans, I also mean escape, I mean choice, I mean autonomy, I mean wanting something greater than what you told me, wanting more possibilities than the one you forced on me." And there's something a bit naughty in there, right? Because we often, for very good reason, avoid describing trans as a choice. That's not often something that we do. But I think both Travis and yourself mean something quite complex by that. So what does autonomy mean to you, and also how does it figure in this book, and how do some of these concerns that Pragya is talking about figure around what constrains our autonomy or what the problems with autonomy are itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the reason that I was so interested by the concept of autonomy too was in the discussion of trans lives, and I do think there's an overlap between our books on this, is yeah, I mean, like there's a whole chapter on kind of, and it's loosely about trans healthcare, but it's called Right and Wrong Bodies. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of trying to translate for a lot of people where trans people's healthcare struggle is like one of the biggest things that actually people I work with care about the most, or talk. If you go to a trans community meeting, everyone's talking about healthcare. But it's the one that I think offers like a mass readership. It's because it's not an area, I mean, it's kind of not sexy to people who aren't trans. To talk about healthcare and bodies in that way, and they've been kind of trained by the media to think of it in a certain way. And I think I've always struggled with the arguments that people advance for trans people's right to access healthcare, to also to fertility, also to sexual health, to all forms of health, as kind of like a defensive thing. I feel, well, we're dysphoric and we need help, and it's about kind of rescuing us, really, because it feels like it comes from the time of pathologization, where it's like trans people are mentally ill, and we might have to allow some people to transition because otherwise they might, they might harm themselves, basically, is the undercurrent. And so to kind of turn that around and talk about autonomy, for me, was a much richer way of kind of trying to communicate to people about how this is a universal human thing. So trans people go through this very specific, or can go through this very specific, healthcare interactions, or through specific experiences, for example, clinical dysphoria or whatever. But actually, I link it to the reproductive autonomy of women and anyone that could be pregnant, to everyone, to queer people's right to sexual autonomy. And for me, it was a richer point of connection, I think, to try and kind of establish how we're actually fighting for very similar things, perhaps on different fronts, to a lot of other groups, like disabled people, women in general, and people of color. And I think there is an issue with autonomy too, because as we were saying, it is shaped by, your class and race experience. So I think it is knotty. I think there is a difficulty there, because I think what Travis was alluding to in that epigraph that you quoted is the possibility. Trans as a political idea is that we move towards a place of greater choice. It doesn't necessarily mean that you wake up one day and choose to be trans, but it's what the political movement and what we might define as trans, because it comes to us from a position of being pathologized by doctors, is that you're a transsexual, and that was a medical diagnosis. If we're going to have a more radical view of what trans might mean in the future, it might mean thinking about ways of getting greater choice for all. It doesn't mean that we currently all have perfect choice, because we obviously don't.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that unpacks autonomy in a really interesting way. And you alluded there, I think, to some of the issues of what you both call reproductive justice, which is an interesting term, not reproductive freedom, but reproductive justice, and how in your book, Shon, that impacts trans people. Can you say a little bit more about just practically what are some, because this may be new to quite a lot of audiences, what are some of the constraints on reproductive justice for trans people, and what are we actually fighting for there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's probably worth saying, which a lot of people don't realize, is that certainly it's like, trans people started to move, particularly like even in Europe, towards legal recognition in the mid-20th century, to starting states, EU member states, starting to grant, for example, trans people legal mechanisms to change their legal sex, for example, on identity documents, to have your identity recognized by the state. I think Sweden was the first European country to do that, but it mandated in return for that legal recognition, compulsory sterilization. Which was essentially eugenics. It was the idea that basically trans people, you could have your legal recognition, but you had to kind of accept you were mentally ill, and therefore you shouldn't be reproducing. I mean, that's where it comes from, and that was commonplace in many European countries. Fortunately, never legally a requirement in the UK, because by the time we passed our Gender Recognition Act in 2004, we didn't mandate surgeries that would inherently require sterilization. However, due to kind of postcode lottery with the NHS and clinical commission groups right now, and access to fertility treatment. Unfortunately, fertility treatment for trans people is not available universally on the NHS, and it's very expensive. So essentially, some trans people are given a binary choice between being able to access medical transition and retaining their biological capacity to reproduce, just because they can't afford to preserve their fertility privately. And that's still a struggle that is affecting people now. So that's a classic huge injustice, I think. And I think it comes from a deep-seated idea about the idea that maybe trans people shouldn't be reproducing, which perhaps isn't consciously in the minds of clinical commissioners now, but I think it's where it comes from.
Yeah. And yet, of course, in the face of those constraints, trans people have found all sorts of interesting ways of reproducing, whether that's biologically or otherwise. And as your podcast title alludes to, mother is a word that can mean some quite unusual things to trans people. And I think that speaks to some of your concerns as well, Pragya, because your whole book is an argument for reproductive justice. And you argue, I think, not just for the ability to have biological children, but also for the ability not to have biological children if you don't want to, the right to abortion. And then you also talk about other forms of motherhood, including adoption and surrogacy. So a very broad view of reproductive justice. And I'm wondering, can you say a bit about what this term justice, potentially rather than freedom, means to you throughout this book?
Yeah.
And how you see us working towards that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about freedom, again, we come back to the same argument that I was making about autonomy. We think that you're free to choose, but there are so many constraints around it. So justice would take a broader intersectional approach as to your context and position in society. So for instance, I was talking about the abortion discourse, and a lot of women in the US who are on Medicaid and are more than 55% are women of color or women or from a lower socioeconomic background, so they cannot access abortion treatment. Maybe it's not allowed in the state, maybe they can't travel because, or it becomes a choice between feeding their children and getting an abortion when they can't even feed their children at the moment. As Shon talks about the NHS postcode lottery, it also exists for other groups as well, about who can take time off work, who can travel to places, who lives in a place where free healthcare, free fertility treatment is allowed or not. We know about the history about how, and it still happens in the US, and it still happened where minority women have made to be undergo forced sterilization because of this belief, this kind of belief of great replacement theory, which existed where this myth existed that actually women of color have larger families and they're going to take over the world because white women are not going to be able to reproduce and they'll have less and less children. And so this pressure on white women to not have abortion and to have children so that it becomes like who's desirable and who's not desirable, as Shon is saying as well, about who has the right to reproduce, who has the right to exist and occupy space in society. So there are all these discourses and debates going on. So justice would mean that actually we take people's context and their position in society into consideration. And it also means that the discrimination in healthcare, we address that because of the language that exists in healthcare, the forms that have to be filled up, how identity is represented in healthcare, who feels discriminated and prejudiced against. We know that Black women, and especially but women of color, die more in maternal childbirth and maternity. We know that forms are still based in our binary identities, so lots of non-binary and trans people actually feel discriminated in healthcare. We know about the language and label about who is a mother, and obviously we talked about the discourse or the case where it went to Supreme Court about who's allowed to use the word mother and who's not a mother. And this whole discourse that's happening at the moment about trying to use gender neutral terms, which some people have really great objections to, which discriminates against some people. And so I think reproductive justice will take all these aspects into consideration about the labels we use, the language we use, and how we allow everybody to access these choices.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're building here to this kind of strident call for a feminism that is intersectional and liberatory, that threads through both of your books. And both of you finish on conclusions about that I found very moving. I'd like to reread those chapters, those closing chapters, when I'm struggling a bit for my own motivation there. But then I ask, you do both have these calls for a liberatory feminism, but what would it take to win the kind of goals that you're looking for? Not to like totally put you on the spot, but what kind of organising or what kind of political movements do we need to move towards reproductive justice, towards a liberatory feminism? I'm going to pass to you first on that one, Pragya.
Yeah, it's we're going to solve all the world problems in one go.
Oh yeah, we'll do it right here, right now. We're going to solve it.
What will it take? It will take for us to actually have a more compassionate view of the world, I think, and to think that actually we can't talk about feminism that is self-serving. I think I see a lot of feminism, people talk about it, which is so deeply rooted in a kind of a self-serving language, but also in very heteronormative views, very cisgender views, very exclusionary views of equality. And I think unless we take a considerate view towards an intersectional approach, again, I use that term again and again because I don't think we are taking an intersectional approach, no matter how much we throw that word around, an inclusive view to feminism and a more compassionate view to feminism, where we think that actually the idea of equality is not that women will replace men or that women will take over the world, but actually we are talking about a place where no matter which group a person belongs to, they have a right to their identity. It's not a privilege we afford people to make allowance for their identities. It's a right that people have to their identities, an unquestioning right that we shouldn't question people's notion of claiming their identities. And it will take, more grassroots movement and less shouting on Twitter, I think.
More grassroots movements and less shouting on Twitter. I think we really got to amongst that wonderful answer a nice just a one easy thing to do there at the end there. Now, Shon, you've had a few more minutes to think about the answer, so I'm really expecting the definite solution to how do we win feminism here?
How do we win feminism? How do we end the patriarchy? Okay. I mean, no, I would echo everything that's already been said. So I think in adding to that, I guess where I tried to look in my book was that obviously, as a trans woman writer, and I do have a chapter on feminism about. I had to think quite hard about, because if you're trying to present a liberatory feminism when people are used to, again, as I say, us writing in quite a defensive way about the idea of us knocking up on the door of a feminism that doesn't really want us, particularly a lot of the UK discourse has been around that. And that's what people think about when they think trans women and feminism. I know this sounds a bit trite, but let me develop the point, was that I'd say we do need to be more hopeful. And the reason why I say we need to be more hopeful is because I think where I have tried to think about why there might be a hostility to, for example, trans people in some strains of feminism, and if I'm being as sympathetic as I can, I would say sometimes there's a pessimism, which I can understand completely, is that feminism has achieved certain things for certain women, perhaps in terms of workplace and in terms of, it's that kind of glass ceiling feminism. And now we've seen a new wave of kind of consumerist feminism online, of tote bags and pink Instagram infographics and people having an Audre Lorde quote but maybe never have read the book. And I think where a lot of people are perhaps feeling pessimistic is that there have been things about gender-based violence, specifically cis male violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. We haven't really seen a reduction in those, in kind of women and other minority genders' fear of violence in the most intimate spheres of their life. And I think what can happen is that there hasn't been kind of, for a while, maybe a sort of radical thinking about how we are going to, as a collectively, as a society, address that. And so it's easier to become very pessimistic, and that's where you can sink into the kind of essentialism of male, female, oppressor, oppressed, violent, sufferer, and these sort of binaries are kind of have a comfort. And I actually think trans people can engage in them as much as cis women. And so I think we have to start thinking, both in terms of grassroots and what that might look like, but I think we have to start to be having hope about the idea about, truly about ways in which we could all live free of violence. And I think, if you want to talk materially about that, I think it's been very difficult in a time of, we've had 10 years of austerity, where support services, where a social safety net, where things that allow people more autonomy, women and minority genders, autonomy and freedom over their own lives has been cut away. So we obviously need to start there in terms of creating that social safety net again. But I think it's also politically about perhaps having more of an optimism and not engaging in the kind of pessimistic form of feminism, which is only ever going to be defensive.
That's fascinating and relates, I think, to what you were saying at the beginning about not wanting to write a defensive book, but almost, in a sense, an offensive book, or a book that advances us forward. And I think both of these books are, in that sense, offensive in terms of moving forward and not always arguing against what we don't like, but arguing for what we do. I could chew this over with you both for ages, and I would really like to, but I'm gonna offer the chance to the audience to get a little bit involved as well, and to ask your own questions about some of this. What does autonomy mean? What visions of feminism do we want to have? So I'm going to take questions both from online and from here, and I will I'll take questions, I think, from online first, to give you some time to think about it off. So I've got a question here from Samantha. Thanks for this, Samantha, which relates to your bit of advice there, Pragya. How do we ignore the Twitterverse? And I'm gonna insert here, like, the whole business of online and a rapid space of moving opinion, and have proper conversations about all of this stuff with the people we live and work with and alongside. So how do we do that work of a little bit getting off the rapid cycle of opinion and building grassroots movements? How do we actually do that work?
I don't think we can completely ignore the social media or space or Twitter. I say that as somebody who's quite active on Twitter, so I hold my hand up. But because I think these are platforms that have democratized the conversation and given space for people to express their opinions who didn't feel like they're empowered or have the authority to express their opinions, or have the space to go and write in newspaper articles or get a newspaper article commissioned, or be on panels and sessions. So I think, but obviously there are downsides to everything like that, because there are people who are just jumping on the bandwagon and shouting about things as well. And it can become very, very polarized, because we do get stuck in our echo chambers. We get stuck in these filter bubbles where we only follow people who agree with us and who only listen to people who think like us. So it becomes so binary and polarized. So I think we can engage with it, but I find it useful to engage with people who don't agree with sometimes, because I need to understand what their perspective is, and that is metaphorically stepping into somebody else's shoes sometimes. I block and mute quite actively as well. But I think you need to feel in control of these conversations. As for having discussions with people in real life, I think it's really important, again, to think about their fears and threats. And as Shon said, I think a lot of prejudices and discrimination come from fear and threat, fear of losing your own status, fear of something unknown, fear of unfamiliar, fear of all those things. And a lot of prejudice comes from that. So I think having a non-judgmental space where we can talk about these things and express our opinions, because we are even not ready to listen to fears of other people and why do they feel afraid, why do they feel like this. I think sometimes people from minority communities have to do all this emotional work of explaining to people why they should listen to us, and I think it shouldn't be like this, but I think because we bring a more kind of, I like to think in my own biased view, a more nuanced opinions to it, we can sit across a table and talk about why people think that this is not a polarized binary debate. Sex-based rights or gender-based rights are not something one or the other that we talk about. There's so much noise around this that it becomes one or the other, and it's never one or the other. It's never just so black and white that we have to just do one or the other. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it certainly moves us towards answers. What about yourself, Shon? How do we stop having shouty conversations and do the organising that matters, I think.
It is a difficult question, because I think social, and I also, like, my platform has come largely from Twitter, so I feel like a bit of a hypocrite But I have changed my relationship with it, and I actually found writing my book helpful because it kind of required me and allowed me, it both required and allowed me to maybe try to explain things in a way. I think because in that short form back and forth about Twitter, one of the reasons I think things around trans politics have become so polarized is because social media rewards outrage. It rewards the most extreme, it rewards an intensity of response more than maybe a nuance of response. It's also very easy in a very clipped, kind of abbreviated kind of form of interaction for you to feel, I mean, I can feel it in myself sometimes, you feel misunderstood and therefore angry, and therefore your response to someone, you know, you respond like you feel misunderstood and you feel angry, and so it carries on. I think it is useful. I mean, like, I suppose like it is useful to think about how we do that work outside, because that is how movements have been successful historically. If you look at the early like gay rights movement, the Gay Liberation Front in the US, who organized with like the Black Panthers and the Gay Liberation Front would like organize with each other, and obviously there was you know, often mutual suspicion between members of these groups. It wasn't that like these were like people who saw people who follow you on Twitter, where what we are all doing is like, I'm part of your tribe, you're part of mine, we're all left wing, we're all about, you know, that's actually not really how successful movements have ever been built. They've required, like, solidarity is not about like who the followers are, that's about reaching across difference, and that's really hard work. I would say what has helped me a little bit was that where I started to sort of like change a bit is I got a platform as a writer when I was working in the charity sector, so doing training sessions for a charity like Stonewall. Often I was doing like very 101 trans inclusion training with people like GPs, receptionists. But I remember what you'd have to do is this contracting at the start, where you basically say, you know, no one's going to be shamed, provided you're not hostile, and provided you're not being aggressive, no one's going to be shamed for getting something wrong. And in that space, you know, that I started to realize there were people, you know, there who were, yeah, they were basically doing, you know, transphobic things in services without even realizing they were. And they would own up to it, because you'd put it up on a thing of like an example of what might be transphobic in a kind of service provision context. And they, you know, they'd be like, oh, I'm a receptionist, I've said that about a trans woman. And actually those conversations were really constructive, because it's like, well, how, you know, there's another way that could go, where you blast this person and then they feel defensive, and they haven't really been provided with the tools to maybe think about their behavior in future. They haven't even been given the tools to understand why it might hurt another person. And so for me, that was quite instructive, and I'm really glad that I had that experience, because I think it made my sort of like, yeah, my writing career also a little bit more thoughtful about the different places you can meet people at. And I don't think Twitter is necessarily conducive to it all the time.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Moving then from online to off, would anyone in our live audience have a question for our authors here? I'm sure somebody must. Down in the front here, we've got a question with a tartan bag.
It's a question and a comment, really, as someone who's lived with a lifelong disability from birth, a disabled man. I think it's really, and I'm more than happy to stand in solidarity with every minority, because as a minority person myself, I'm constantly othered, as is every minority group. And I think what needs to happen is that we need to see each other's common humanity. We need to create spaces for that to happen. But we also need to, I think, be prepared to understand each other and understand that we all come at the journey of life scarred and traumatized, and that things are difficult. But if we can see we're all in the journey together, that's the best place to start. So I just wonder, do you think the pandemic will be the humanizing event that maybe helps some people stop making judgments about the other and see them as people first?
Thank you. Wow, a big question. Yeah, a big and important question. What has been the effect of the pandemic on feminism, on movements, and on our ability to connect across minorities and across traumas in this way? I'll go to Shon first this time.
Well, I think it's been mixed. I mean, I think there have been some really positive things, especially, you know, when the pandemic first started, of things like, you know, certain concepts of like mutual aid coming back into kind of like, you know, mainstream discussion. I mean, I know that a lot of people started talking about like Facebook groups that became a bit like snooping on your neighbours. But there were some really powerful examples of mutual aid. So, for example, Swarm, the sex worker-led collective, when sex workers, you know, especially in the first lockdowns, and sex workers are obviously, there's a group where like single mothers are overrepresented, disabled women are overrepresented, queer people are overrepresented, trans people, is that, you know, people, you know, these kind of like, you know, these sex worker-led collectives, creating mutual aid funds, creating resources and care for one another in a minority community, I think was a really amazing example of something that the pandemic certainly like informed me about a different way of doing politics. I think we do have to resist. I hope it will. I mean, obviously that we still have to resist. I think there'll be a concerted effort to deflect blame. And obviously we've seen top-down governments, media trying to get us to all blame each other for things that have gone wrong structurally in the pandemic, rather than maybe hold people in power to account. So I think the importance is to treat each other with care and humanity. And also to think about consciously about sometimes if we're being encouraged to blame other people, particularly other people who are having a hard time, where is that blame coming from and where are those narratives coming from? Just to challenge ourselves and to think about in whose interest is it for us to be blaming each other, particularly if we're all from different groups that maybe aren't having the easiest time.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. A hopeful answer, I think. And what about yourself, Pragya?
First of all, thank you so much for that comment. And yes, I do agree with so much of what you said about seeing other people's humanities and crossing the divide. And I also agree with Shon about how some of these fear of outside groups, these in-group, out-group, these divides that are created benefit politicians, for instance, and these rifts that are created, and we fall into these divides, and we start believing that these lines are really hard between in-groups and out-groups. And we know from research that the more that we draw these lines, and we are more discriminatory towards people who are outside our group. But yes, pandemic has been an equalizer in a way, but also shown us about how the imbalance in our society and the systemic inequalities that exist, the structural inequalities, about how privilege really affected people's position and the impact that the pandemic had on them. And I think we become more conscious and aware of our privileges. It also showed us which groups are carrying more emotional, mental, physical load in our society, who are more susceptible to be affected by the pandemic. People who didn't have a garden, people who didn't live near a seaside or a walk, or people who are stuck in small houses, people who had to work on frontline, people who couldn't work from home, the digital inequality, all those things have become more, I think, more prominent. And so I hope that as we move forward, we don't just forget everything that we've seen and everything that's been shown and kind of fall back into the old ways of doing things and the old ways of believing things and structuring a society, because that's the comfortable place to be. And our brains naturally fall back into the lazy, comfortable ways of thinking and being, because that's easier and that's less cognitive load, and we all like to be in our comfortable spaces. So I think it'll take some discomfort still. We can't just idolize the pandemic or the lockdown and say that this is going to be like huge change unless we actively make sure that this change happens. I
think that's really true. And I know for myself, kind of through that the pandemic has both strengthened my solidarity and my need for solidarity, and it's also kind of intensified my anger about where that solidarity has been so lacking so often.
Exactly.
So thanks for that answer. I'll take another question from online. I've got a Heather P here who is quite rightly pointed out that I've been throwing the word liberatory around without any definition whatsoever. So what does liberation mean to each of you from your perspectives, and how can we move towards this within a society that might, at least seemingly, actively work against liberation? What about yourself, Pragya?
I think we've talked about freedom and we've talked about justice and autonomy. So in a way, we've defined what liberation and liberatory means, I feel, because it's about equality for all, but I think it's also breaking the shackles of some of these frameworks that we're defining equality in at the moment, because unless we kind of break these frameworks, we'll keep coming back to these old habits or old ways of being and old hierarchies that we exist in, and it'll be so difficult to do that. So I think we need to examine these frameworks within which we are thinking about equality as well, these constructs, metaphorically and also politically and all those things, and the linguistic frameworks as well that we define our identities in and our structure and society in as well. And I think it will take, so that's, I think, for me, a vision of true liberation would be is kind of breaking aside this kind of capitalist structures and white supremacy and all those hierarchical structures that we currently exist in, you know.
Wonderful, and that means both breaking them materially and also breaking the way that they live in our minds and the way that we think about the world. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. What do you have to say about that, Shon? What's liberation for you, and how do we get it?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's only to echo. I mean, I use the term liberation specifically in my book in a way because I thought people are very used to hearing maybe trans rights or trans equality. And what I say, pretty much in the prologue, is that the trouble with those concepts is that they're very limiting because actually trans people, if we're thinking intersectionally, trans people are one type of person, right? We exist in different ways, and transness is not the only, and often not the most important characteristic for many of us, depending on our nationality, our citizenship, our race, our disability status, etc. And so for me, it was less about trans equality, for example, because I thought that trans people wouldn't benefit from being equal in a society that is fundamentally unequal. It's kind of a contradiction. So it's kind of worry to echo is that liberation is about the idea that to liberate yourself would also to be dismantle the society around you as it's currently built, because it's so often built on inequality, on injustice. And so it's about kind of, considering a broader movement for a politics that is about freedom for everyone and justice for everyone. I would also agree that it's not really compatible with capitalism. I'm a socialist writer, so I would say that. But I think for me, liberation is about something wider than just trying to emancipate yourself, which often equality and even trans rights can sound like, because often there can be, you might get certain legal or civil rights, but you're not actually able to exercise them. And often that's to do with your class, that's to do with your race, to do with social welfare net, social safety net. So for me, I would echo that really. I think for me, liberation is about thinking about a much more radical view. And by radical, I mean the roots of society, literally from the Latin, like go to the roots of what's an issue in society and think more expansively.
Yeah, I just wanted to add also that I think I completely agree. Sometimes there's a temptation to kind of minimize all of us into one identity, one label. And we are not just one identity. I'm not just a woman or a woman of color, or you're not just a trans woman. We are multiple identities. We are different things and in different contexts. So I think it becomes such a limiting, kind of a diminishing view if we are just talking about equality for one of our identities, or even liberation in terms of one single identity. And unless we think about these multiple intersecting identities and how they are placed within these structures that we have constructed, these frameworks, we cannot, I think, achieve liberation.
Whew. Thank you. Yes, definitely. I think we have time for a short final question from the audience. So it'll have to be a short one. Yes, we've got a question in the middle on my left here.
Hi, thank you for this. It's a really fascinating and necessary conversation. Was there anything in the researching and writing of your books that either surprised you, shocked you, or perhaps changed you?
That's a lovely final question. Thank you. I'll pass that to Shon first. What surprised or changed you in your book?
I'm wondering what surprised or changed me. I think what was happening when I wrote my book, I wrote most of my book I'll answer the question that I'm augmenting the question, I'm doing that sneaky thing. But I wrote my book, most of it in the first lockdown, in the first draft. And I think the resurgence of Black Lives Matter around the world at the time that was happening, and of course the coronavirus pandemic, that we forget now, like with the first lockdown, how apocalyptic, there we go, it felt. I think that had a profound influence on what I wrote about the book, because I think there was a fearfulness about making perhaps more radical arguments. So, for example, I knew that I was going to write about trans people in prison, but I was a little bit wary of making an argument that sort of was fully against prisons. But then we saw, the prisoners were being kept in their cell for 24 hours a day to control the spread of the virus. And that just seemed so inhumane. And I was worried about making arguments against policing, for example, because I was like, I'm already trying to get people on board with trans people. Now I'm going to also say that I don't think policing and hate crime laws are the perfect solution. But then we were seeing this worldwide mass movement against police brutality. And so I think when I was writing the book, the global circumstances that were happening around it definitely informed the book, and they changed how I wrote it.
Thanks for that clear answer, and also for pushing the arguments to where you did. I think it's all the more powerful for it. What about yourself? What changed for you in this book?
I think there's a lot of in it that I write that I hadn't really talked about before. So while I was writing it, I think I was also confronting a lot of this internalized shame and stigma about some of the things that I haven't really discussed before. So, when I looked at the research from history, but also contemporary studies and contemporary case studies as well, it made me angry. It made me realize that actually this is not a discourse that's over. This is not something that we can just talk about and put away. There is so much need to actually talk about it more and more, and we are seeing that now when we are seeing that the conversation is so focused on this low birth rate in the world, this push towards women to have more children, and on one hand, we're talking about how pandemic has made us realize about the inequalities, the gender inequalities, about how mothers are discriminated against, how single mothers are discriminated against. But on the other hand, there is this whole discourse of push that's happening. And I think it made me realize that a lot of these things are due to the ideologies of patriarchy and the misogyny that's so inherent in our language and in our systems and frameworks. So I think it reaffirmed a lot of that. It surprised me about how open I could be about my experiences and how resonant that was with other people as well. And much like what Shon said, globally, that what was happening in the US with the whole abortion discourse, it made me realize how many of these decisions are taken by men in power about women, and it just made me realize how deep-seated these inequalities are, I think.
Thank you. Thanks for that great note to finish on. Sadly, I do have to wrap up this conversation, and it's a conversation I've been looking forward to for a couple of weeks now, and a conversation that I'm delighted to have had with you both. I think that's really moved a whole set of thoughts forward for me, and I hope for audiences as well. Both Shon Faye's The Transgender Issue and Pragya Agarwal's Motherhood are available in the Book Festival shop, on site and online at shop.edbookfest.co.uk. And Pragya, I think, will be signing books, yes, after the event. So don't miss out on that. And please let this conversation continue, both in the courtyard here at the Book Festival at the Edinburgh College of Art, and also online as well. So thank you to Dr. Pragya Agarwal. Thank you to Shon Faye. Thanks to our audience live here and to our online audience as well. And thanks to the Book Festival for hosting this conversation. It's been great to be with you all.
Thank you to you.
Thank you, Josie.
So well.
Okay. All right. Goodbye.